Commercial Property Roadshow with Helen Tarrant. People ask me this question all the time about what is my criteria? How do I find the right criteria for commercial property? Because when I look at commercial property, I'm worried about whether the tenant's going to stay. I'm worried about whether the lease is right. I'm worried about my location. Sometimes I'm worried about that they painted the building orange over a neutral color as gray. But so what exactly should be my criteria for commercial property? Now, everybody's individual in what they look for in their portfolio or in their first commercial property purchase. But generally, my rule of thumb is have 3 criteria that is really, really important to you. Now, you might want to have 2 criteria out of those 3 that's non-negotiable and 1 that you're willing to negotiate a little bit about. Because you see, if you go out and make 5 or 6 property criteria that are most important, you're going to be looking for the next 2 years for that perfect property. In essence, you're not looking for the perfect property in commercial property because it doesn't exist. What you are looking for is a good property that you can make great as part of your journey by owning that property. So a property has to have the basic characteristics in order to make it a great property. So what are the 3 criteria? Well, what are some of the criteria you want to include in your 3 top criteria you have to look for? Well, if you want to find out more, listen up to the rest of the video, but please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you can get my notifications of every new video on commercial property. Let's launch into it. So, what are some of the criteria for commercial property you should be looking for? Well, number 1, there is long leases. Number 2, stable tenants, tenant history, location, type of property. So, residential commercial mix properties, looking at warehouse, industrial properties, those small type tilt slab business warehousing with office space properties, or pure office and retail properties, or maybe a mixture of office and retail, so a mixed freestanding building. Now, commercial property, you've got strata or freestanding buildings, so as equivalent to buying a house or an apartment. Which one do you like? What about area specific? Do you want it to be within 5, 10, 15 k's of a metro area? Do you want to be in regional because you're getting the high yield? Is high yield really, really important? Are you happy with a 6% return, or do you want a 9 or 10% return? What do you want? What about growth? Is growth important to you? So do you want to be in a metro city so that you know that in the future, next few years, as growth comes back in, you're going to capitalize on that growth? Or growth is not so important because you have a lot of residential properties and that's why you're holding them for growth, and that you're really holding commercial property for the cash flow? Well, if that's the case, then maybe regional will work for you because it's got the higher yields. All right. Well, those are so many different criteria. Which one is the right one for you? Now, so I always look at it this way. When you buy your first commercial property, you got to look at what can make you sleep at night. So because the first commercial property, you're going to feel a little bit jittery. You are going to feel like, oh my God, I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. You're trying to line up all the ducks, where in a commercial transaction, you're just not going to be able to line up all your ducks. You're going to be able to line up a few in the beginning, and then you're going to have to do the rest of the due diligence when you're under contract. And then when you settle the property, you might have to do some work to make that property really great. So how is that journey? And where does this criteria come in? So for me, when you first start out, there's 3 criteria you should have. So out of all the criteria, some of the things that I look at is tenant profile. Tenant profile is really, really important for me as a criteria in my list. Now, one of the reasons why tenant profile is so important is that it doesn't matter if the tenant in some sense signed a 3-year lease or a 5-year lease or a 7-year lease. It's more about what the tenant is and what they're doing. So a medical tenant, an allied health tenant, a professional tenant, or a trade tenant, which one of these tenants mostly resounds with you? Because that's going to impact on your return. So for example, if I wanted a medical type tenant, then I know I'm going to get a less yield or a less return because it is one of the most sought after in the market, and most people are going to pay a premium for a medical tenant. So if I'm a medical tenant, I might want a GP in there, I might want, a specialist in there, or, a dental clinic in there, anything that's related to medical in there. I might be able to say, okay, well, I might prefer an allied health tenant, which means that that's your type of tenants that are assisting the medical type tenant. So you might have physios, chiros, podiatrists, eye doctors, all of those things that might just, help to surround the medical, and they're just as have longevity and reliable as the medical type tenant. But then you might think, okay, I want a professional type tenant. Well, that's going to be your financial planners, your accountants, your lawyers, and pretty much the type of tenants that once they're there, that they like an established place, so the customers can visit them. Or perhaps you prefer a trade tenant because they're in a space that's versatile, because they can be a mechanic, they can be a distributor, they can be a hairdresser, all of those things that also, once they're in there, they're there for the long term. But maybe all of these tenants don't work for you, and you prefer to have a government tenant, because a government tenant, once they go in there, they take care of their property, and then they're there for the next 20 years. So whichever it is that you like, I encourage you to do a little bit of research in the different tenants, because tenant profile does play a huge role in deciding on the yield or the return of your property. So if you choose to have a particular profile, particular type of tenant, you also have to accept the return. So if you say, for example, I want a medical tenant, and I want a property that's yielding 9%. Well, the two criteria actually clash, and you're not really going to find that property. So it's better to say, okay, well, I want a medical tenant, and I'm happy to accept 6% because that tenant was worth more, and I associate more security with that type of tenant. So have a think about that as your first criteria. The second criteria to think about is the location or the type of property. So either the location or the type of property. Now, if you choose both, that's fine. But again, that means that, your return might be reflected in that as well. So the type of property we're looking at could be a warehouse, retail, or office space. So when you look at those three broad categories, you can have a think about what really resounds with you. And maybe that requires a little bit of research online to look at, warehouse properties, what's the pros and cons of that, retail properties and pros and cons, and also office property as well. And also I'll be making some videos on that as well. So make sure you really do hit the subscribe button and the bell, so you can get notifications when I have upcoming videos on these particular topics on commercial property. One of these properties is going to resound with you. So whichever one that is, you want to be choosing that as your category, because when you buy the first property, it has to be something that really sits well with you, so that you know that you can sleep at night knowing that your tenant's there, and that yes, that you're in a property that you feel really comfortable with. Because after 3 months of being in your first commercial property, I guarantee you'll go, well, there hasn't been a cyclone or a storm that's, taken the roof off my property. There hasn't been a flood that swept my property away, and my tenant hasn't packed up and left, and they're still paying me rent. At that point, you're going to decide, well, it really doesn't matter as long as there is the return. I'm happy to go anywhere. See, but before you get that realization and that aha moment, you are going to want to be starting your first property with something that you're really, really comfortable with. So let's get started with, looking at the different type of properties. So that's one of the things you should do some research on, apart from your tenant profile. Now, following from that, the third criteria you might want to consider is location. So metro versus regional. And I have a separate video on that, so really check that out. Metro versus regional. Which one is better with you? So does having a property in a city area like Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne really resound with you? Because if it does, then you're going to have to accept the yields in that area or the return in that area. Or does it not matter? As long as you get the right tenant profile and the right type of property, you can go anywhere, because you know that the tenant behaves the same no matter which state or where they are, whether they're regional or metro. So that may mean that you are quite happy to go into a regional area and get a higher return. So look at the location and look at what that really impacts on you. So maybe your criteria could be tenant profile, the type of property, and also then looking at whether you have a preference for regional or metro areas. So that might fit your three criteria to start with. But there's also a few other ones to consider as well, and that is lease term, maybe the lease term is really important to you. Maybe you need something on a 3, 5, 7-year lease to make you feel more secure. So if that's the case, then you may have to, forgo some of the other property types, or maybe you have to forgo the tenant, maybe going to allied health rather than medical, or maybe government tenants. You may have to play around with that mix, but there's another option as well. The other thing is the type of leases, and you may want, okay, I want a longer lease, but I also want to be structuring there. I want rental increases from my tenants, so rather than my normal CPI, I want 3%, 4% type of increases, because that's more important to me, because I'm getting more cash flow coming in. Or for some of you, the particular location is really important. So I want to be not only in a metro area, but 5Ks or 10Ks within metro of any city. And then, I'm happy to accept a lower return. So that might be another criteria. Also, another criteria you might think about is that perhaps, the yield is really important. And for some of you, yield is important. So, it doesn't matter what tenant I get. It doesn't matter what the lease term. It doesn't matter what type. But as long as I'm getting 9% yield, that's all that's important to me. Well, if that's the case, then that should be one of your top criteria. Like I said, in commercial property, there's many, many different type of criteria you can put. But the main thing is not to lock yourself in so tightly that you're trying to find the property doesn't exist, to try to find the unicorn. Like I said, you're rather better off building a portfolio of multiple properties that you're creating your own unique unicorn. So to wrap up today, really have a think about the criteria that you want. Make sure you come up with 3 top criteria, but 2 are non-negotiable, really, really important, and 1 that you can negotiate to the best of your abilities. And remember, your journey through your commercial property should be buying a good property and making it great through that commercial property journey. So until next video, I hope that's been a really, really great tip for you, looking at your criteria, and I hope that helps you on your journey to buy your first commercial property. Check out helentarrant.com if you want more information, and really make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so that you get my new upcoming videos. Bye for now.